The road outside Sahiwal was nothing in 1829. A line of dust between fields. A man on horseback, sunburnt and silent, looking for a place to spend the night before the next leg of his journey toward Lahore. His name that month was Charles Masson, though that wasn't really his name. He had deserted the British East India Company's army 2 years earlier, somewhere outside Agra, and he had been moving west ever since, inventing himself as he went. A coin collector, a scholar, an American from Kentucky, depending on who was asking. What he saw when he came around a bend in the road stopped him. Not a hill, not exactly, something larger. Bricks rising out of the ground in long, exposed stretches, their edges still sharp as if they had been baked yesterday. Walls collapsed in on themselves, a geometry beneath the earth that no village built by hand. Masson made a sketch. He wrote a few paragraphs, and he reached the only conclusion that made sense to a European in his time and place. These, he decided, were the ruins of Alexander the Great. He was wrong by about 2,000 years. Nearly a century would pass before anyone realized what was actually beneath that dust. A century of railway crews carting off the ancient bricks to lay track between Multan and Lahore. Nearly 100 miles of railway supported on the bones of something the world had not yet learned to name. By the time the Archaeological Survey of India sent men with shovels back to that mound, the upper layers were gone, plundered, forgotten. In January of 1921, a man named Dayaram Sani put a spade into the ground at Harappa. The order had come from Sir John Marshall, then Director General of the Survey, who had quietly suspected for years that something older than the Vedas, older than Alexander, older than memory itself, was waiting in the Punjab. A year later, 250 miles to the south, another archaeologist began digging into a different mound in Sindh province. The local people called the place Mohenjo-Daro, Mound of the Dead, because of all the bones the wind kept exposing. When Marshall held up what they had found, he could not believe his own eyes. He was looking at a city, not a village that had grown into a town, not a tribal settlement, a planned, intentional, mathematical city. Streets in a grid oriented to the cardinal points, houses 2 stories tall, drains under every road, wells in every neighborhood, brick walls with bricks so uniform that, as scholars would later confirm, they followed the same ratio across hundreds of miles of territory, 1 to 2 to 4. A standardized code in clay repeated by 1,000 unknown hands. On the 24th of September 1924, Marshall made the announcement public in the pages of the Illustrated London News. The headline was reserved. The truth, slowly, would not be. There had been a civilization here, a vast one, stretching across what is now Pakistan, northwest India, and parts of Afghanistan, covering roughly 1.5 million square kilometers, an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It had at least 1,400 settlements, 5 great cities, a population, some scholars now estimate, of as many as 5 million people. Trading with Mesopotamia, importing lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, exporting carnelian beads so finely drilled that even today they cannot be reproduced by hand. And it ran deep. Beneath these Bronze Age cities lay older settlements still, stretching back to a place called Mehrgarh in the Baluchistan hills, where the dead had been buried with small terracotta goddesses as far back as 7,000 before the Common Era, before the first stone of any pyramid had ever been cut. And here is what struck Marshall most. Here is what changed how we tell the story. In Egypt, the great works were tombs. In Mesopotamia, palaces and ziggurats, monuments to kings. The whole point of those civilizations, architecturally, was hierarchy. The pharaoh stood at the top. The temple priest stood near him. Everyone else was a labor pool. But at Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, for all the digging, for all the centuries of buried evidence, no one has ever found a palace. No one has ever found a clear, indisputable temple. No royal tombs, no throne rooms, no statues of conquerors riding over fallen enemies. What they found instead was infrastructure. Sewage drains, public baths, wells, granaries. The finest brickwork in the ancient world poured into the things that made life livable for ordinary people. Here is what I find striking. We tend to assume civilization requires a strong man on top, a king, a god emperor, someone to crack the whip. But for 7 centuries, on the banks of the Indus, between roughly 2600 and 1900 before the Common Era, somebody built something that worked without one. Or at least without leaving behind the kind of evidence that powerful men usually demand history leave behind them. That alone should change the way we think about where religion came from. In the heart of Mohenjo-Daro, on a raised platform they called the Citadel, there was a pool. 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, 2.5 meters deep. The bricks were sawn smooth and joined so tightly that water could not seep between them. Underneath, a sealer of natural bitumen, black, tar-like, ancient. 2 staircases descended into the basin, one from the north and one from the south. A drain led the used water out through a corbelled arch, the earliest known of its kind in the ancient world. It was, scholars now agree, the oldest public water tank ever built. And the question that no one has been able to settle, even after a century of digging, is what it was for. Some say it was a swimming pool. Others say it was for ritual purification, a place where the body was prepared, washed clean of the world, before approaching something sacred. The fact that the citadel had no temple beside it, no obvious deity to bow toward, only deepens the mystery. If the Great Bath was sacred, and most scholars now believe it was, then the people who built it worshipped, perhaps, the act of bathing itself, the water, the descent, the clean return. If that sounds familiar to anyone alive today in India, it should. Some 5,000 years later, ritual bathing remains one of the oldest, most continuous spiritual practices on the subcontinent. The pilgrims who descend the steps into the Ganges every morning are doing something their distant ancestors may have been doing in that very basin in Mohenjo-Daro, while the pyramids were still being polished in Egypt. And then there is the seal. In the excavation season of 1928 to 1929, in a block south of the Great Bath, a small object was lifted from the dust. It measured just over 3.5 centimeters on each side, a square of steatite, soft, soapy stone, carved by a hand long since turned to silence. In the center of the seal sat a figure, cross-legged, heels pressed together, the unmistakable posture that students of yoga today still recognize. The figure wore a tall, horned headdress, and his face, possibly his 3 faces, looked out toward the viewer with the calm of someone who had been looking out from that stone for a very long time. Around him, animals, an elephant, a tiger, a water buffalo, a rhinoceros. Under his throne, 2 small ibexes. Above the figure, a row of symbols in a script no one alive can read. When John Marshall first published his analysis of this seal in 1928, he gave it a name borrowed from the Hindu tradition, Pashupati, Lord of the Beasts. An early form, Marshall believed, a Bronze Age ancestor, of the god the world would later come to know as Shiva. Marshall's identification has been argued over for almost a century now. Some scholars accept it. Others, including Doris Srinivasan, Alf Hilterbytel, and a long line of careful skeptics, believe he read too much later Hindu iconography into a much older image. Here is what we can say without controversy. The figure on that seal, whoever he was seated in a yogic pose nearly 2,000 years before the word yoga first appeared in any surviving text. The horned crown, the encircling animals, the meditative stillness. These are not the accidents of a primitive culture stumbling toward art. They are deliberate. They are coded. They are pointing at something. And whatever that something was, it would not stay buried. The river the people of the Indus had worshipped, the river, the bath, the silence, would in time fall away. The cities would empty, the streets would fill with sand. The language they spoke would die without ever being read by another human eye. And yet something of them, something specific, something measurable in posture and breath, and the descent of a body into water, would still be alive on the subcontinent 5,000 years later. The civilization disappeared. The vibration did not. In a museum in Istanbul today, there is a clay tablet, about the size of a man's hand, baked hard, cracked at the edges. The cuneiform marks pressed into its surface were made by a scribe in a palace in what is now central Turkey, sometime around the year 1400 before the Common Era. The tablet is a treaty, a diplomatic agreement between two kings, the Hittite king of Anatolia and a foreign king whose realm lay further east in northern Syria, a place called Mitanni. What makes the tablet remarkable is not the politics. What makes it remarkable are the names listed at the bottom as witnesses to the oath. Indra, Varuna, Mitra, the Nasatyas. These are not Hittite gods. They are not Syrian gods. They are the gods of the Rigveda. The gods who would, within a few generations, be sung to in the Punjab by the firelight of a culture that thought of itself as living at the edge of the world. And someone in northern Syria, 1,500 miles from the Indus River, knew their names. How did the gods of a people who would not become India for another 500 years end up in a treaty in Anatolia? The answer is a story about chariots, about chants, and about a slow, profound collision that would create one of the most enduring spiritual traditions on earth. 2,000 miles north of the Indus, along the cold rim of the Eurasian steppe, modern Russia, modern Kazakhstan, there was a culture that would later be called Sintashta. Around 2100 before the Common Era, they were doing something that had never been done. They were burying their dead with chariots. Not the heavy, four-wheeled ox carts the world had known until then, light chariots, 2 wheels, spoked, pulled by horses bred for speed. They were the first true war machines in human history, and the men buried beside them were the first chariot drivers, riding into the afterlife the same way they had ridden into battle. This was the homeland. The descendants of these people, over the next 6 or 7 centuries, would slowly fan out across the largest landmass on Earth. West, into Europe, where they would seed the languages the world now calls Germanic, Italic, and Celtic. South, through the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, into the plains of what is now Pakistan and northern India. And along the way, somewhere in the iron of their saddles and the rhythm of their hymns, they carried a language. One language, one root. Scholars call it Proto-Indo-European. Its descendants are spoken today by nearly half the people alive on this planet. The same root sits beneath the words for father, for sky, for fire, even for God, from English to Hindi to Greek to Bengali. The branch of this great family that wandered south into the subcontinent became what we now call the Indo-Aryans. Not a race, Not a tribe with hard borders, a linguistic group. People who spoke an early form of Sanskrit and who carried their language and their fires across the mountains into the alluvial plains of the Punjab, somewhere between 2000 and 1500 before the Common Era. For a long time, Western scholars told this story badly. The Victorians, working with the racial assumptions of their century, imagined the Aryans as a fair-skinned, conquering horde, sweeping down from the north, burning the cities of the Indus to the ground, subjugating the dark-skinned natives, forcing their religion onto a defeated population. The story was called the Aryan invasion theory. The British archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler championed a version of it after the Second World War. It dominated textbooks for the better part of a century. It was wrong. Modern archaeology found no evidence of any such invasion, no burnt cities, no mass graves, no sudden cultural break. The great Indus cities had emptied long before any Indo-Aryans arrived, almost certainly through climate change and the drying of the rivers that had fed them. There was no horde at the gates because the gates had been abandoned. And then, in 2019, the ancient DNA evidence arrived. A team of geneticists, led by Vagish Narasimhan, working with bone samples from across South and Central Asia, settled the question. Modern Indians carry a measurable strand of steppe ancestry that did not exist in the subcontinent before 2000, before the Common Era. The migration was real, but it was not an invasion. It was slow, generational, sometimes peaceful, often by all available evidence, deeply intermarried. Two worlds did not crash into each other, they walked into each other, and over centuries they merged. What the migrants brought with them was not a culture, it was a kit. They brought Sanskrit, which would become the sacred tongue of nearly 1 billion people. They brought the horse, almost entirely absent from the Indus Valley world. They brought the spoke-wheeled chariot. They brought a god named Indra, who threw lightning, a god named Agni, who lived in fire, a drink they pressed from a mountain plant they called soma, perhaps a kind of ephedra, perhaps something stranger, which they believed gave them the vision of the gods themselves. And they brought something even more difficult to carry across mountains, a memory, an oral tradition so disciplined, so mathematically exact, that it could pass an entire library, verse by verse, syllable by syllable, across 30 centuries without writing a single word down. This memory became the Rigveda, 1,028 hymns, 10 books, they called them mandalas, circles, arranged in a sequence that may itself have been a kind of calendar. Composed somewhere in the Punjab between roughly 1500 and 1200 before the Common Era, sung at fires, memorized by sons from fathers, refined by generations of priests who, even when writing finally became available in India, refused to commit the hymns to ink, believing that to write them down would be to kill them. 250 of those hymns belong to a single god, the warrior, the thunderer, the drinker of soma, Indra. Now picture two religious worlds. In one, the older one, the world of the Indus River cities, the sacred act was descent, a body lowered into water, a silence kept, a figure carved into stone, sitting alone, surrounded by animals, saying nothing. In the other, the new one, the steppe one, the sacred act was ascent, a flame lifted toward the sky, a hymn shouted into the air, a liquid poured, a horse sacrificed, the god summoned, not approached, water against fire, silence against chant, the inner posture of one tradition, the outer altar of the other. If you had stood at the boundary, around 1200 before the Common Era, you might have thought these two worlds had nothing to say to each other. You would have been wrong. Here is what I find striking. When religious traditions meet, really meet, over centuries on the same landscape, They rarely choose one or the other. They braid, slowly, generation by generation. The newcomers pick up something from the people they marry into. The older population pick up something from the gods their grandchildren now worship. That is what happened in the Punjab. The Indo-Aryans over time began to settle. They built farms next to the older Harappan towns. Their fire altars stayed lit, but pools and bathing platforms began to reappear in their villages, even though nothing in the early Rigveda asked for one. Indra remained powerful, but other gods whose names the migrants had not brought with them, began to climb into the hymns. A horned ascetic figure, a mother goddess in the fields, a serpent in the river. 3,000 years later, you can still see both inheritances breathing in modern Hindu practice. Every morning, somewhere in India, a priest lights the sacred fire of Agni, the gift of the chariot drivers from the steppe. And every morning, somewhere else, a pilgrim walks down a flight of worn stone steps into a river, the older gift, the gift of the silent cities that came before. Two gifts, one faith, carried between them by everyone who came after. The treaty in northern Syria, the clay tablet with Indra's name pressed into it, was sealed and forgotten and buried under sand. The chariots rotted, the horses died. The men who first sang the Rigveda were dust before their own grandchildren had grown. But what they brought across the mountains did not die, and what they found on the other side did not die. The two together became something neither had been alone, a tradition with no single founder, no fixed dogma, no central scripture standing above all the others. A tradition still arguing with itself 3,000 years later about what it actually is. It was a tradition without borders, a tradition without a founder, a tradition that did not, even then, have a single name for itself. And it was already beginning to ask the only question that mattered. Not who created the world, not which god is greatest, not what rituals please the sky. A different question. What is the self? And what, beneath the fire and beneath the water, beneath the chant and beneath the silence, is the thing that does not change? How does a religion become deep? Not how does it begin, not how it spreads, not how it survives. How does it become deep? The kind of deep where someone 3,000 years later can still drop a question into it and feel the bottom give way. There is no easy answer. But if you wanted to point to a moment, a place, a stretch of country and time where the depth opened up, you could do worse than to walk into the forests of the upper Ganges plain, somewhere between 800 and 500 before the Common Era, and listen. Because something was happening there that the world had not heard before. By that century, the men who had once stood at fire altars and shouted hymns to Indra were old. Their sons had inherited the rituals. Their grandsons were inheriting them too. The Vedic religion, the great fire and chant tradition that the steppe migrants had carried over the mountains, had become, in many places, something like a state machine. Larger sacrifices, longer ceremonies, more animals, more priests, more fees paid to the priests for performing them. For most people, it worked. The rain came, the crops grew, the kings won wars. The fire on the altar was the same fire that had been lit by the first ancestors, and to keep it lit was to keep the world from falling apart. But a few people, in every generation, looked at the spectacle of the sacrifice and asked a different question. What if the fire is inside? What if the real altar is not the stone platform in the courtyard, but something inside the body of the person standing in front of it? What if the gods being summoned, Indra, Agni, Varuna, are not, in the end, the point? What if there is something older than the gods, something that the gods themselves rise out of, the way a wave rises out of the sea? The men and women asking these questions did not stay in the villages. They walked into the forest. They were called later Vanaprasthas, forest dwellers. The third stage of an old Indian life after the student and the householder, when a person turned away from the world and went into the trees to think. The texts they composed, or rather the texts they spoke aloud to small circles of students sitting near them in clearings, came to be called Aranyakas, forest books. And the most distilled, the most piercing, the most concentrated of those teachings were given a different name still, Upanishads. The word itself is plain: upa, near; ni, down; sad, to sit down near, to sit down close. The image is of a student lowering himself onto the ground in front of a teacher, close enough to hear the words spoken quietly, close enough to ask. The whole genre is named after the posture of listening. There are over 200 of them. The earliest, the great ones, the ones still translated into English by modern scholars like Patrick Olivelle at Oxford, were composed somewhere between 800 and 500 before the Common Era. The oldest is called the Brihadaranyaka, the Great Forest Upanishad, attributed to a sage named Yajnavalkya. The longest is the Chandogya. Together they make up the foundation of philosophical Hinduism, and through it, of philosophical Buddhism, and through Buddhism, of much of what the modern world means when it uses the word spirituality at all. And what they were doing in those forest clearings was something genuinely new. The Vedic hymns had been outward-facing. The world was full of gods. The gods needed to be praised, fed, asked. The Upanishadic sages turned the gaze around. They began to ask not what is out there, but what is in here. What is the thing that sees? What is the thing that thinks? What is the thing that does not change, beneath every change? They had a word for it: Atman, the self. Not the personality, not the body, not the memories, the bare, irreducible fact of being. And then, in one of the most audacious moves in the history of human thought, they made a claim. The Atman, they said, is identical with Brahman. Brahman, the word is hard to translate. It does not mean God in the Western sense. It does not mean creator. It means something more like the ground, the reality beneath every appearance, the unchanging being out of which everything that changes is briefly made. The thing the wave is, when the wave forgets it is a wave. The self, the sages said, and the ground of the universe are the same thing. There is a famous formula from the Brihadaranyaka, 3 Sanskrit words. Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. There is another from the Chandogya, almost as old. Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that. Here is what I find astonishing. In one culture, on one continent, in roughly the same century that Greek philosophers were beginning to ask what the world was made of and arriving at answers like water or fire or atoms, in that same century, men in the forests of North India were arriving at the answer, you. You are what the world is made of. The thing looking out of your eyes is the thing being looked at. The implications, if you took the claim seriously, were enormous. If you and the universe are made of the same stuff, then the priest at the altar is no closer to the divine than the farmer in the field. The fire ritual is not, in the end, indispensable. The caste system is, at the deepest level, a kind of illusion. Death is not what you thought it was. Even the gods, even Indra himself, are inside Brahman, not above it. This was a quiet earthquake. It did not destroy the Vedic religion. The fires kept burning. The priests kept being paid. The hymns are still sung today, 3,000 years later, at weddings and funerals and dawn ceremonies all over the subcontinent. But beneath the visible religion, something deeper had been planted. A way of asking the question that, once planted, could not be uprooted. And here is where the tradition did something most other religions did not do. It did not enforce a single answer. The Upanishads themselves do not agree with each other. Yajnavalkya, the central voice of the Brihadaranyaka, taught a method he called neti neti. Not this, not this. Brahman cannot be described. Every description falls short. You can only point at it by saying what it is not. Other sages in other forests taught differently. Some emphasized devotion, some emphasized knowledge, some emphasized silence, some emphasized song. The tradition kept all of them. And so, when later generations of Indians met new gods, village gods, tribal gods, mountain gods, river gods, they had a framework for what to do. They did not destroy those gods. They did not call their worshippers heretics. They absorbed. A wooden tribal deity in the forests of what is now Odisha, worshipped by the Savara people, became, over centuries, Jagannath, Lord of the universe, a form of Vishnu. The original Savara priestly families still serve in his temple today, 3,000 years after the first carving of his eyes. A tiger sacred to the Bhils and the Gonds, two of the oldest tribal peoples of central India, became the mount of the goddess Durga, who rides into battle on his back. Serpents worshipped at the roots of trees in pre-Aryan villages became Nagas, divine serpents, coiled around the necks of Shiva and the dreams of Vishnu. The pattern repeated, century after century, region after region. Hinduism, by the time history began to take real notice of it, did not have a single founder, did not have a single book, did not have a single god. It had thousands. And it had a quiet, philosophical idea, taught in the forest, that all of those thousands were, in the end, faces of one ground. You might think this makes the tradition vague, loose, lacking a backbone. The way I read it is the opposite. A religion that can absorb that much and still ask sharp questions at its center is not weak. It is structurally generous. It is built to last beyond the empires of its own time, built to outlive the kings who fund it, the languages that surround it, the conquerors who think they will erase it. And it has. The sages in the forests did not know, when they spoke their words to the students sitting near them, that those words would still be carried 3,000 years later in the mouths of children memorizing Sanskrit verses in modern Mumbai and modern Mysore and modern Toronto. They did not know that the question they planted, what is the self, would still be the question. But the question was that good, and the people who asked it, sitting in the half-light of a clearing where the only sound was wind and breath and a teacher's slow voice, had stumbled into something the human species would not be done with for a very long time, if ever. Imagine that, somewhere in the second millennium before the Common Era, a single decision had gone the other way. Imagine that the migrants who came down from the steppe, riding their light chariots into the plains of the Punjab, had done what migrants in other places and other centuries chose to do. Imagine they had burned the towns of the people they found there. Imagine they had outlawed the older worship, the silent bathing, the seated yogic figures on the seals, the mother goddesses in the household shrines. Imagine they had insisted that their fire gods, Indra and Agni, were the only real gods, and that the older powers of the river were demons in disguise. That story would not have been unusual. It is, in many ways, the standard story of how a religion replaces another religion. It happened to the gods of pre-Christian Europe. It happened to the gods of pre-Islamic Arabia. It happened again and again across most of the ancient world. A new faith arrives. The old shrines are torn down, the old names are forgotten, the library closes. In India, the library did not close. Nobody planned this. Nobody sat down in some forest clearing and decided that the river religion and the fire religion would be allowed to braid together, that the local goddess in every village would be allowed to become a face of a larger goddess, that the tribal deity in the trees would be granted an entry on the list of Vishnu's 10 avatars. There was no committee. There was no edict. The merging happened the way most deep things happen in history, slowly, by 1,000 small concessions, by marriages and migrations and the patient logic of people who lived next door to each other and finally found a way for their grandchildren to share a temple. And what came out of that long, unplanned conversation, by the time anyone thought to write a name on it, was something the modern world has never quite known what to do with. A religion older than the word religion. Pull the threads together for a moment. The seated figure on the small steatite seal, lifted from the dust of Mohenjo-Daro in the excavation season of 1928, surrounded by his animals, saying nothing. The 1,028 hymns of the Rigveda, sung by men who had never seen the cities on the Indus, but whose tongues had been shaped 2,000 miles north by horses and chariots and the long grass of the steppe. The forest sages who, somewhere between 800 and 500 before the Common Era, walked out of those hymns and into a question deeper than any hymn could carry. The wooden tribal god in the forests of Odisha, whose original priests still serve in his temple today, 3,000 years after his eyes were first carved. These are not four religions. They are not a sequence of replacements, one tradition overthrowing another. They are layers, all still present, all still active, all still arguing with each other inside the same enormous tent. The classical Sanskrit name for this tradition, the name its practitioners often prefer to the foreign-sounding Hinduism, is Sanatana Dharma, eternal Dharma, eternal order. The earliest classical use of the phrase is found in the Manusmriti, a legal and ritual text composed somewhere between the 1st and the 3rd century of the Common Era, and again in the Bhagavata Purana several centuries later. But the modern force of the name, the way it is spoken with weight today, came much later still. It became a banner in the late 19th century, lifted by Hindu reformers in colonial India who needed a word to defend their tradition against the missionaries and the Orientalists and the new ideologies pressing in from every side. The word Hindu, oddly, is not Indian. It is Persian. It was originally the Persian way of saying Sindhu, the great river the Greeks would later call the Indus. To the early Persians, Hindu just meant the people who lived east of that river. Geography, not theology. The word slipped into Arabic, into Turkish, into the languages of every empire that washed into the subcontinent, until at last, in the early 19th century, British scholars took the word and put the suffix "ism" on the end of it, and a foreign label became, for 1.5 billion people, the closest thing to a name their faith would ever have in English. This is the only major world religion named, in effect, by a river, by a place, by the people who happen to live there. Which is exactly right, because Sanatana Dharma was never trying to be a religion in the European or Middle Eastern sense. It had no creed to recite, no single book to bow to, no founder to baptize after, no moment of revelation that severed the new faith from the old. It was simply what the people on the eastern side of that river had done, generation after generation, to make sense of being alive. And what they had done, by the time the modern world looked over and tried to count, was build a tradition with no walls. Roughly 1.25 billion human beings on this planet today consider themselves in some way inside it. The vast majority of them have never met. They speak hundreds of languages. They worship gods their neighbors 100 miles away have never heard of. They follow rituals their cousins 3 states over would find unfamiliar. They argue with each other about almost everything, and they still call it one tradition. Here is what I find worth sitting with at the end of this long story. The modern world has spent the better part of 2 centuries trying to organize human meaning around hard borders, hard religious borders, hard national borders, hard political identities. Are you with us or are you with them? Do you believe this or do you believe that? Pick one, sign the line, defend the border. The tradition that grew up on the eastern side of the Indus did not, for most of its history, run on that logic. It ran on the older logic of the forest sages, the one who told their students that Brahman cannot be described, that every description falls short, that the only honest reply is neti neti, not this, not this, that every name is provisional, that every god is a face, that every ritual is a finger pointing at something the finger is not. It is easy, looking at any single moment in the history of Hinduism, to find a contradiction, a bloody one, a cruel one, a caste system that excluded, a king who used the religion as a weapon, a reformer who was attacked for asking the wrong question. The tradition is human. It has done what every human tradition has done. But the architecture is something else. A religion that does not have to win to survive. A religion that does not have to convert anyone. A religion that, when it meets a stranger's god, does not, by reflex, reach for a sword. A religion whose oldest written word, neti neti, is a refusal to define itself. In a world full of certainties competing to swallow each other, the certainties of nations, of ideologies, of platforms, of algorithms, there is something quietly radical about a tradition that, after 5,000 years, still answers its deepest question with the words, "Not this." The bricks at Mohenjo-Daro are still there, out in the dust of southern Pakistan, slowly losing edges to wind and salt and time. The Great Bath is empty now. Nobody descends those stairs. Nobody knows with any certainty what the silent figure on the seal believed. The script he and his neighbours used remains undeciphered. The exact sequence of how their world ended is still argued over by people who will never know all of it. But the gesture they made, the descent into water, the seated stillness, the silence, did not end with them. The fire altar of the steppe migrants, lit somewhere on the long ride down from Sintashta, did not go out. The forest sages, sitting under trees that have long since fallen, did not stop being heard. The wooden gods of the tribal villages, the goddesses in the fields, the serpents at the roots, the river herself, none of it was lost. It was all kept, it was all carried, it was all braided into something that, when you stand back from it, looks less like a religion in the modern sense than like a memory, a living one. Of every way the people of one stretch of land have tried, across 5,000 years, to ask the question that does not change. What is the self? And what, beneath every fire and every river, every name and every god, is the thing that does not change? The candle burns low, the story sleeps for now. Stay curious.